Good evening. I hope you've been having a wonderful Sunday. Hope you got in a worship service with us this morning, maybe spending some time with your family and things like that. I've continued to say this, but I'm going to remind you one more time. The elders will be meeting Monday night, and we're just firming up some last minute instructions that we're going to put out sometime next week. It'll probably be in the bulletin, but there may also be a phone tree and maybe a special MailChimp mailing that will have some instructions for our plans on opening up next Sunday morning, May the 24th. Just some instructions and some guidelines to help us to come together safely, and some things maybe that the elders have been working on to try to help keep everyone safe. So keep a lookout on your email next week, and be waiting for the possibility of a phone call, something like that may be coming into you, or it certainly will be coming into you next week. It's already in the works. The first draft is drawn up, and that's going to be firmed up Monday night, and so that will be coming out to you as far as further instruction goes. Now, again, continue to share these devotionals with your family, with your friends. We will continue to have, we're going to only have Sunday morning service, so we'll have our devotional still on Wednesday and Sunday. But of course, we'll also be streaming Sunday morning live, just as we always have. And the sermon will fall somewhere in the 9:30 time frame. So not much will be changed along those lines. Of course, we'll have the Lord's Supper and things of that nature if you want to follow along next Sunday morning. So that's still an option for you if you're not comfortable with being at the building next Sunday morning, or if you feel that you're at special risk or something along those lines, then or maybe you feel that you put others at special risk. So whatever it is that your situation is, you'll have to take that and determine that. And the elders are having the gathering as an option, but we'll also have as an option the live streaming. So that's what's going on next week. As far as the devotional goes, I opened up my email this morning, and I know that you guys know by now that I'm always interested in what's going on in history. And it just so happens that on May the 17th in 1954, that was the day that the Supreme Court handed down a 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of the Brown family in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, this case had to do with the segregation of schools, and some of this was wound up in different laws, like they're referred to as the Jim Crow laws. Some of it went back all the way to around 1896 with a case that was Plessy versus Ferguson, in which they determined a separate but equal status in regards to traveling on railroad cars. So this was the day that segregation of schools thing began to come to an end. Struck a chord with me because my sermon this morning was dealing with 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 9. And if you remember and you tuned in with us, or you happen to know what that verse says, you would know that David told Solomon that the Lord searches all hearts and understands the intents of the thoughts. You see, God is able to see what's on the inside of us. He's able to see what's in our mind. The interesting thing about that even more is that we go all the way back to when David, even before he had become king, Samuel had gone up to the household of Jesse and was preparing to anoint a king. And as they paraded each one of the sons across, Samuel and Jesse were looking at the outward appearance of the man, but God gave some instructions to the contrary. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, he says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Now, I'm not convinced in any form or fashion that we're not to pass any judgment in this life. I know that we are to pass some judgments. I know this because of places like Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus talks about some ravenous wolves that were going to be coming in, or some wolves in sheep's clothing. He says in verse 15 of Matthew chapter 7, "Beware of false prophets who come into you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves." Now, how are you going to figure out what's going on with these people if you're not figuring out or passing some kind of judgment? Well, he continues on in verse 16, and he says, "You will know them by their fruits." And then he closes that little section in verse 20, and he says, "Therefore by their fruits you will know them." So you see, there is some judgment that we have to pass in this life, but it is a righteous judgment. God has set the standards by His Word, and there are times when we have to determine we're not to accept false prophets, we're not to accept every wind that blows through and things of that nature, but we are to judge them by their works. Now, that's a righteous judgment, and it doesn't have anything to do with a man's features or the color of his skin or what country he is from or anything of that nature. This is a righteous judgment based on a man's works. And unfortunately, this is still a problem today. We may think that all the way back to 1954 and everything that's gone on since that this would have been put away, but it's still a problem. It's even a problem more than I wish in our churches. We have congregations that are completely split. We have congregations that gather together and almost completely of one ethnicity. And I wish that was not the case. I wish that our congregations were completely non-segregated, that we had all different people from all different races and nations just gathering together. So we need to get away from that kind of thinking. I think our country made the right move in that direction many, many years ago, but unfortunately, it's still something that we have to battle against. And so it is still a problem today. Interesting to me, one of my favorite verses along these lines is in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26. People throw all these things out there like they're just ridiculous in regards to like the mark of Cain and things like that. And I'm quick to come with Acts chapter 17 when Paul's preaching on Mars Hill. In verse 26 he says, "And God has made from one blood every nation of man to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." So you see, God has made from one blood, every nation of man to dwell on all the face of the earth. So that's an important verse to keep in mind, I think. Some further teaching about this comes from our Lord in Luke chapter 10. You see, we know we're supposed to love our neighbor from verses like Luke chapter 10 and verse 27. You know the greatest commandment is love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus had given us those commandments. And here in this spot, we have a young man that is kind of somewhat tempting Jesus, if you will. And he says that those are the greatest commandments. And then he wants to ask this question about who his neighbor is. You see, he was wanting to be justified. Who is my neighbor? And I think Jesus taught him a lesson that he was not expecting. You see, the Jewish nation, they were somewhat prejudiced against Samaritans at that time. And Jesus gives us this parable of the Good Samaritan. The man, the priest that should have been helping out the man that had fallen by the side of the road, that had been taken over by robbers. The priest, the others, they should have helped him. But who's the one that helps this man? It was the Samaritan, the one that he thought was least likely. The point was that everyone is your neighbor. You're not to discriminate against anyone. So love your neighbor as yourself. That's some good teaching that we could take and make application to. Friends, we're supposed to love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. If we do that, we're going to keep His commandments. And one of the greatest ones is to love our neighbor as ourself. And that's not just picking specific ones that we want to love, because, you know, even the wicked can love those who do good to them, but we're supposed to love everyone. And especially we're supposed to look at what's in a person's heart and not be passing judgment based on what they look like. I just hope that you'll take this little thought with you this week. Do your best to give your heart, soul, and mind to God. Do your best to love your neighbor as yourself. Don't pass any judgments based on the way that a person looks, but look for a person that's right in the heart. Thank you once again, and I pray that you have a blessed week.